Welcome to Justice Beyond the Bench, a podcast by the International Association of Women Judges. I'm Jane Charles Voltaire.
And I'm Amy Lewis. In this series, we spotlight women across the global justice sector who are leading efforts to advance gender equality, strengthen judicial systems, and champion inclusive leadership.
From courtrooms to communities, we'll hear powerful stories and unpack the strategies shaping women's leadership in law and the judiciary. It's time to go beyond the bench.
Today, we're honored to spotlight Justice Ayesha Malik, an extraordinary jurist whose career has reshaped the face of Pakistan's judiciary and inspired women worldwide.
Born in Lahore and educated in Paris, New York, London, and Pakistan, Justice Malik went on to study law at Harvard, where she was named a London H. Gammon Fellow for her exceptional merit. After years of practice in corporate and litigation law, she joined the Lahore High Court in 2012, serving for a decade on the bench.
In January 2022, she made history as the first woman ever appointed to Pakistan's Supreme Court, breaking centuries of precedent and opening a path for future women leaders at the highest levels of the judiciary.
Her body of work is remarkable. She declared virginity tests unconstitutional, expanded the definition of workplace harassment, ruled against the trial of civilians in military courts, and strengthened protections for women's property, environmental justice, and climate accountability.
Justice Malik's influence extends far beyond Pakistan. She has represented the judiciary at international forums, including COP climate conferences, and she's been recognized by the BBC, Forbes, Middle Temple, Equality Now, and the University of London with an honorary doctorate.
Justice Malik, welcome to Justice Beyond the Bench and to our episode, Supreme Voices, Women Shaping the Highest Courts with Aisha Malik.
Welcome, Justice Malik.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Maybe let's just start with your path to the bench. As we mentioned, you were educated across several continents and later studied law at Harvard. How did this international background shape your outlook on justice and your path to the judiciary?
Well, thank you again for having me. My journey to the bench and my thinking towards how I'm going to work as a justice has been shaped by my background, by my experiences in the way that I have lived my life. Having lived and studied across different continents, I have come to appreciate the diversity of different legal systems and the perspectives that they embody. Each jurisdiction, be it Pakistan or the United States or the UK, reflects a distinct understanding of law, of justice, and social responsibility, which is shaped by its history as well as social context. This experience reinforced my conviction that legal reasoning cannot be confined to just one single dimension. The law must be responsive to the society it governs. So the experience made me more sensitive to the missing gender perspective within our justice sector. Our legal landscape is such that it is applied and interpreted with really one perspective. It's one dimensional, and that is the experience and the interpretation given by men and their understanding of the lived experiences of women. This is so the entire jurisprudence and landscape really is reflective of their decision making, whether it's on the administrative side or whether it's on the judicial side. But for me, when I became a judge, thinking about the gender perspective meant that I began to question whether justice was truly being done in areas like workplace harassment or gender-based violence, where the lived experiences of women were missing from the reasoning, where their stories were not being heard, and where the judgment didn't really reflect what the woman thought, what she experienced. So this understanding has been central to my approach as a judge to ensure that the law speaks to women, not speaks at them. And you see that in some of my judgments, like the two-finger test judgment, where the court held that medical examinations are invasive, unscientific, and grounded in a patriarchal assumption that chastity rather than evidence or even science is what will determine whether a survivor has been raped or not. And the judgment once again looks at the entire concept of this two finger test from the gender perspective to declare that it was unconstitutional because it didn't consider the dignity and the bodily autonomy of women and the constitutional guarantees given to women for such things. For me, the case symbolized what it means to bring the gender perspective to law and to center women's lived realities in the pursuit of justice. So, my focus really has been from my life experience to bring out the voices and stories of women, to bring out their experiences, and to bring out the gender perspective.
You speak so clearly about the necessity for bringing in this perspective from women as jurists, but also women's lived experience overall. And I think that's so critical to being able to reshape how we consider, as you said, jurisprudence that has really been rooted only in a perspective across the world from men. And so, really appreciate you giving us this example with regards to the virginity test and how that really helps to embody how you're looking at your role as a justice. But before your appointment, even as onto the Supreme Court, you also served on the Lahore High Court, Justice Malik, where you helped to establish also gender-based violence courts and organized the first women's judges conference in the Punjab region. During those conferences, many women judges highlighted the lack of basic facilities, such as restrooms, prayer rooms, and chambers. So, can you talk a little bit more about also in that experience, what motivated you to continue to champion those initiatives and how you view progress towards workplace equity today?
Yes, I think motivation has always been about giving women a voice and to make safe spaces where women can be heard. And I think women judges play a crucial role here because they can create those spaces as part of the system and as part of the first step towards developing an understanding of what a gender perspective means in practice. When we organized the first conference for women judges, it was really the first time that these women judges were invited to speak openly about their experiences in the system and the absence of basic facilities like restrooms and chambers and prayer space and what it meant to them. It was the first time that they could speak about policies and decisions which affected them and which they felt really didn't see them and consider them. That first conference was followed by two other conferences at a regional level and two conferences at a national level. And in all these conferences, women judges started talking about their cases, the impact that decisions have on women in family disputes, domestic abuse, gender based violence, and so on. So they started looking for common areas, they started looking at differences. But the thing that the conferences brought out was that women judges saw the systemic gaps in procedure, in sensitivity, and the institutional support. And then they saw how that impacted the delivery of justice and even their own professional experience as women within the judiciary. At one of the conferences, and if I recall, the IAWJ was there, we discussed the role of women judges developing the gender perspective. And we then saw how these women had quickly moved towards that narrative of contributing and integrating a gender perspective within their decision making. And this really showed that change has to be made. These conferences highlighted that if we want the system to be fair and practical, and we want it to be accessible, then we have to change the way we think. More importantly, it gave these women a place to speak. It gave them a place where they could give their input on what they thought was necessary to improve the system. The results were very visible. Soon thereafter, we had the GBV courts, we had gender sensitivity training, we even had a committee which looked at issues pertaining to women in the district judiciary. So the conversation started, and judges recognized the need to engage more deeply with this gender perspective and what it means in practice, how they can bring it into their courtroom, into their judgments, and also how they, as women judges, what is their role? What can they do? When we talk about the GBV courts, it's important to notice or to at least highlight that this is also sort of institutional learning. These courts were designed to ensure privacy, timely hearings. They were designed so that judges would be trained to handle such a sensitive subject matter and also to preserve the dignity of the survivor. So it basically also showed the institution that justice delivery can be both efficient and respectful of the particular circumstances of the survivor, particularly the gender. Another one of the initiatives, which was the Committee on Women Judges, really focused on improving working conditions for women. And although the response at the time was not as forthcoming as it should have been, nonetheless, it gave them a platform, a place where they could bring their issues in a formal or an informal way, so that we could work towards solutions. And like I said, the conversation had started. For me, that was important, that the conversation start, and the objective of making sure that the voices of these women are heard was necessary. So we started looking at barriers and looking at those barriers of how they were limiting access to justice, which I think was an achievement in itself.
It absolutely is an achievement in and of itself, and the way that you talk about giving women judges a platform where they could speak, they could air the things that they're seeing, they could discuss these barriers and also work towards solutions, just even starting this conversation. And we know that that starts with, like you said, just giving women space and allowing their voices to be heard. But we also know that that representation matters as well, and that the public and the community needs to see women on the bench and needs to see the way that jurisprudence and the delivery of justice is shaped by those lived realities and taking into account the lived realities of, women that are navigating the system. And I think, in you becoming the first woman appointed to Pakistan's Supreme Court, that being a defining moment, I know you've talked about your role as a woman on the bench, but also what it means to be a voice for other women as well. And I was wondering if you could maybe tell us a little bit more, like, what did that moment and that appointment mean to you personally? But what do you think it also means for other women in law across Pakistan and beyond?
Well, I think it was a meaningful moment for me as well as for all women who have aspired to find their place in this profession. For many, seeing one woman on the Supreme Court, it was a ray of hope. It opened the door ever so slightly, but it gave women in the profession the hope that maybe they too could walk through the door. And this is important because Pakistan's population demographics is such that 50% of the population are women. Yet their representation in the judiciary is limited to 17%. And when we look at 17%, that has to be understood that this is a figure where there are less women in the higher judiciary, meaning the high courts and the Supreme Court, say 5 to 6%, and the remaining 12% or so is of women in the district judiciary. And I'm saddened to say that today these numbers are going down because you're not finding a lot of women interested in joining the judiciary. So this is important for us to look at and for us to understand that visibility matters. Not only visibility, acceptability matters. So you don't want to just see the woman, you want to see that she's accepted and that she's part of the system. In my case, it took 74 years for a woman to get to the Supreme Court. And when it happened, it wasn't welcomed as progress, rather, it was a controversy. My appointment was heavily debated and it was contested and challenged. And it took almost 6 months for me to eventually, from my nomination, find myself in the Supreme Court. I think one of the issues was probably that it was new, it was different, it was something that had never been done before, and maybe the unfamiliarity made people wonder, how I would fit into the system and what my coming into the system would bring and how it would change. I think it also, the fact that I say that the door may have opened ever so slightly, the bigger challenge then became the mindset. And the mindset, I think, is one of Pakistan's biggest questions, or one of Pakistan's biggest challenges on how to change this mindset. For me personally, it was natural progression of my career. Any judge working in the High Court will be looking to work their way towards the next court, which is the Supreme Court, which is the final authority for settling important questions of law. But it also meant for me that here was a court where I could write judgments, where I could bring out the voice and the story of the women, where I could show that representation matters. I think it also was gave me the opportunity to wholeheartedly be able to participate and bring out the fact that inclusion is important, acceptability is important, participation is important, and the gender perspective does matter. I so my time on the bench has been spent writing judgments where I have tried to bring out the voice of these women, to bring out their experiences, and to show how the interpretation of the law has to be looked at through the gender perspective, particularly when we are looking at fundamental rights such as dignity and equality, and when we're trying to understand how different issues impact the lives of women. And I think matters for women is that when they see another woman on the bench, what they understand is that there is someone who will at least appreciate our point of view. So, for example, in the harassment at the workplace case, which is the Nadia Naz case, I sat on the bench which looked at the original judgment in review jurisdiction. And the original judgment basically said that workplace harassment is harassment if it has a sexual connotation. Whereas the review judgment revisited the entire concept of workplace harassment and said that it includes sex based discrimination, and that it is the conduct of the harasser which affects the workplace environment, and that's what we have to look at, and it does not require a sexual connotation. So here you see how the gender perspective seeps into the judgment, into the courtroom, and really changes the landscape in just one case. So this is a way that you communicate not only within your institution and show how fairness and equality can come through judgments, but you also give out that message to the women that there is hope, that we shouldn't lose hope, and that we must continue to work on the narrative to include the gender perspective. Women have to become a part of the system, and in my opinion, an inclusive judiciary is one that really reflects the composition of society.
You speak to an experience that I think we've been seeing across the board and in so many different country contexts as well, where even where women have reached senior judicial positions, overall numbers remain low. Pakistan continues to reflect a similar trend where representation has not increased dramatically. What does that suggest about deeper institutional or societal barriers that still need to be addressed?
So I'd like to say at the very onset that there has been progress. There has been progress, but in my opinion, the progress is slow. And it doesn't really help the women if the progress is so slow. So there are deep rooted barriers, and those deep rooted barriers make it very difficult for women to access courts, even to go to the police. The barriers make it even difficult for women in the profession, as judges, as lawyers, or in any capacity to advance in their careers. There is still discomfort with women in professional and decision making spaces. So there is a lack of acceptability. It's a mindset issue that questions women's presence, their competence, and their right to lead. This is what I often call and refer to as the working woman syndrome, where the idea of a woman's professional life represents the fact that she has abdicated from her primary and perhaps only role in recognized by society, and that is her status as a mother, as a wife, as a sister or daughter. So the mindset becomes a barrier in itself because that shapes how women are perceived at the workplace and how they have to be treated at the workplace. So, where the number of women, there has been an increase in the number of working women, there's an increase in the number of lawyers, even judges. The fact of the matter is that this underlying problem of the mindset continues. And one of the reason is that this is a system that was built by men for men. It's designed to facilitate their participation, not women's participation. Even today, the decision makers are men, and they decide what the system needs. And as a result, whether it's structural changes or it's institutional changes, they don't really fully accommodate women's realities. They don't really consider the gender perspective. And sometimes I do comment on the fact that decisions are taken for me, but no one has asked me what my opinion is. I'm there and I can be asked, but I've not been asked. And the same will apply to other women who work in the High Court or in the district judiciary. When we think of housing, residences, when we think of safe transport, restrooms, posting, transfer, all of these issues have to be thought through from the gender perspective. And if these barriers continue and we continue looking at things in a manner that has existed over the years, we're not really making it more inclusive. Like I said, there has been progress and we are looking at the progress, but I've moved from gender being looked at as diversity to look asking for substantive equality. It's no longer about this is a diverse group and we have to include them in some context. It's basically half the population of the country. So we have to treat gender as a foundational aspect of how the system operates, of how we want it to deliver this service of justice, and how we want our women to adapt within it. So while the numbers have improved, the mindset has not changed. And what we now need to focus on is this barrier of the mindset and work in creating a new narrative which will make it easier and safer for women to work on their own terms.
I think that's such a powerful concept, giving women the ability to work on their own terms, right? And you've spoken a lot about, why women's representation and on the bench and that visibility matters. And particularly because, like you said, that the judiciary is a system built by men for men, that they're the decision makers and that they don't really accommodate or understand even women's lived realities. So, what do you think ultimately changes in the culture of the judiciary itself when a woman is appointed to the highest court? And furthermore, how does women's leadership in law and taking the gender perspective into account or treating gender as this foundational aspect strengthen the judiciary and also society?
Very important question to understand. When women join the bench, the culture of judging changes. It shifts from that one dimensional narrative to a more inclusive narrative because it brings into the narrative a different perspective. And here I think it's also important to differentiate between gender sensitivity and a gender perspective. Gender sensitivity is when you ask the system to be aware and conscious of the gender based on their difference and be conscious of the bias, the discrimination, be conscious of the needs of the gender in the overall system or its structure, its facilitation. But when we talk about the gender perspective, that's totally different. The gender perspective means integrating women's lived realities into the reasoning of the judgment. It's about understanding the impact that decisions have, that law has, that actions or inactions have on women, and whether that impacts women differently from men, allowing those differences to be recognized and acknowledged and to become a part of the jurisprudence. What happens when women come onto the bench is that they bring with them their own lived experiences, their understanding of how things impact women. They bring with them their own stories. And that is what helps bring public trust. It builds up on public trust, it builds up on public confidence because you have something, you have another perspective. Women judges, through their perspective, through their language, make a difference. They change the way the courts are perceived. We have to remember that male and female judges decide cases the same way. and they apply the law in the same way. But it's the reasoning, the language, and the framing of the matter that changes when a woman sits on the bench. The narrative in the judgment, the language that is used, the emphasis that is brought out in the judgment is what the gender perspective is all about. So it's important because if I'm not able to emphasize on things that are important for women, then things that are important for women are left out of the narrative. And we just are sort of ignoring serious issues. So when the Supreme Court looks at a pension case, which is a recent judgment that I've done, we focused on recognizing the daughter's independent right as a legal heir of her parent to inherit the right to get pension. And the law was designed in such a way that it was depriving women, particularly women if they were married, of the pension. But this judgment says that no, it is a basic right which she inherits as the daughter, and you can't have conditions imposed upon it. So when I say reasoning reflects fairness, it brings into the process equality, it brings in balance and inclusiveness. This is what restores confidence in the court system. And this is what helps change the narrative. So I think I would say that the presence of women on the bench is a reminder of what inclusion can look like. And it is also a reminder that there should be more representation of women because justice is stronger when it speaks in more than one voice.
I think that's really key what you also said with regards to, men and women are going to look at cases and they're going to decide them fairly, justly, independently. But it's really about the language and the judgment and other kind of perspectives with regards to how they come to their reasoning and to their decision making, where you're also going to see that big difference. You've written judgments and you just described one where that range from advancing women's rights to safeguarding other constitutional protections. How do you balance judicial independence with the pressures of tradition, politics, public opinion, as a woman judge?
I think judicial independence is the cornerstone of fair and impartial decision making. And as a woman, I believe that judicial independence is strengthened when every member of the judiciary can contribute fully and can bring in their perspective. When women are present in the courtroom and women are heard in the courtroom, they start occupying space and their narrative starts contributing towards the jurisprudence that is laid out. And that is what contributes towards judicial independence. The challenge is to ensure that women judges' presence is not symbolic, but it is treated as something that is required, a necessity, and that not only her reasoning must be engaged with, her dissent must be respected, and her authorship should be visible. So it's not just about putting out a judgment. You want it all. You want people to recognize the fact that you have stated a way of looking at the law, and that has to be given the same level of respect, acknowledgement, and acceptance that any other judgment would. I think the good thing here is that this has started, and and I find that now more and more judges, not just women, are engaging with these issues. So you have a lot of male judges in the judiciary who are authoring progressive judgments, particularly in areas that affect and impact women. So again, this is a good thing, and this happens because there is now a narrative to engage with. So it's nice to see that the Supreme Court and the high courts are now reaffirming that harassment is about control and not about desire, or that a wife's right to maintenance begins after her marriage is actually codified, or the nikah, and it's not conditional on her going to the husband's home, that a married daughter remains equally the child of her deceased parent and cannot be denied pension. These are all cases where the story of the woman has come to court. It's been highlighted. It is the voice of the woman that you read in these judgments, and it is ultimately a decision that has impacted and helping to change the life of women. Moving forward, I think it's important that this continues. It's important that we keep addressing the narrative, we keep addressing the mindset, we keep addressing the institutional culture issues, and we keep looking at how we look at justice and how justice is delivered. And whenever there is an issue where the gender perspective is missing, where the story of the woman is not being told, we constantly remind the system that we have to work towards a balanced judiciary, because without that balanced judiciary, you're not going to get a fair and representative judiciary. In Pakistan, probably some of the more fundamental problems are getting data and information, also getting the system to just change by way of policy. There has to be a lot of discussion, a lot of communication. There has to be a lot of understanding that takes place so that the system starts responding. But I think it's important because it's not only relevant for the women judges and the lawyers, women lawyers or prosecutors in the system, but it's also important for the litigant, the woman litigant who is now accessing the courts more and more. And the barriers that she faces have to also be highlighted, like cost or stigma or fear. And we have to start focusing on those barriers as well, and help to remove them. So to sort of answer your question about how these issues are all balanced, again, they're balanced by bringing out the stories. They're balanced by pointing out where the problems are, where the custom or the tradition or the culture is taking over and the law has sort of been ignored. And in fact, I can just share that in a judgment that's going to be coming out soon, we've actually focused on these issues. We've focused on the language of the court and how the court has not relied on evidence and the law, but more on notions and presumptions and cultural values, which are not what the court is supposed to do.
Yeah, I think when we're talking about, looking at the way justice is delivered and how even men are engaging on these issues and the importance of, like you said, having a narrative to engage with. And, we talk a lot about the perspective that women judges bring, but also what it means for women judges to serve as mentors, serve as guides, to really nurture the next generation of young lawyers, of young judges, and also to help them understand, things like feminist judgment writing, or like you said, the difference between gender sensitization and the gender perspective, and you've even developed courses and you do actively mentor young lawyers and judges. And why do you see this mentorship or this kind of paving this pathway as critical to judicial leadership?
I think mentorship is critical. Mentorship is about building communities, it's about allowing people to learn how to navigate their own professional lives, their personal lives. It's about building ladders so that the momentum continues. And that's how institutions grow stronger, because mentorship enables and facilitates conversation. It facilitates sustainability towards changing mindsets. It basically creates more space. And in the context of women, women mentors don't need to replace male mentors, but women mentors help other women understand better what their role is, how they can tackle the problems, and how they're not alone. It's in the legal profession, I think it's important because it helps young lawyers understand that there is a way forward, there is a path to tread. It requires perseverance, it requires strength and resilience, but that it doesn't mean that it's not doable for them. And female mentorship is important for these young ladies because it gives them role models, it gives them a support system, it shows them that they can make their dreams come true. They can achieve anything they set their mind to. Because if one woman is there, then 10 women can be there, 100 women can be there. There is no limit on the number of women can be there. So I think mentorship is very important. It offers you guidance, it builds communities, it allows shared experiences to start coming into the narrative. And more importantly, it challenges the existing status quo, because mentorship creates more leaders. And the more leaders you have, the more space you make, the more accessible the system becomes.
Absolutely. We've definitely at IWJ, as you know, I think tried to create opportunities and space for different generations of judges and justices to be able to connect and to be able to learn from one another and to see the path, and really appreciate all of your insights with regards to how mentorship enables and facilitates that communication, that conversation building community. That really resonates, I think, with so much of the why of creating these networks. And so now to kind of shift it also onto you, and maybe along the way, you could share with us who are some of the figures, mentors, colleagues who shaped your own journey, Justice Malik, and what did you learn from them that you carry into your role today?
Absolutely. When I began, all my colleagues were men. There wasn't a woman to look for guidance or even for perspective. So, in many ways, I had to learn by watching, by adapting, by figuring it out and holding my ground. And while there's strength in finding the way yourself, it can be lonely and it can be very difficult. The absence of women in the system meant that I had to sort of look at things myself about what it meant to be a judge, what professionalism looks like from my point of view, what is acceptable for me, what is not acceptable for me. And while I did have many male colleagues who were helpful and who gave me guidance, the fact of the matter was that it didn't really help me understand what my role could be. I think what changed drastically for me, or what changed my entire perspective on this, was when I became a part of the IAWJ. That experience for me was a big change in the entire way of feeling that I was alone. I suddenly became a part of a community with over 1,000 members from around the world. I was talking to women judges and sharing experiences, and now I felt that I could actually hear people give me advice on things where they actually heard me, where they understood what I was talking about, where they could share their own stories and their challenges, and just share how they've made their way through the judiciary. So for the first time, I found my community where experiences were understood without explanations, and where the experiences and the challenges felt familiar. So you could all have a laugh at something together because you understood the challenge and the hardship you've gone through. And now looking back at it, it's kind of, you want to give it sort of a lighter touch and say we've all experienced the same thing. It gave me a sense of belonging, it gave me a sense of community, and I've made great friends, lifelong friends. And I think that's how institutions evolve. And while I think probably one of the biggest role that the IAWJ played for me was the teaching me the value of sharing experience and learning by exchanging experiences. I also got to see how different jurisdictions have dealt with this issue of the gender perspective, of having many women judges or having no women judges at all. I think the IAWJ has played a very important role in helping me shape my judicial career. And then by way of support, I've had my family, which is my husband and my kids, and my mother, my father, my brother. Everybody has played a major role in supporting me. So they've always stood by me and never let me really sort of feel that this is something I cannot do.
I love what you have to say about, well, of course, the IWJ, but really the role of community and the importance of not feeling alone. And we know that the judicial profession can feel quite isolating, and particularly when you're the only woman or the first woman, and being able to find that community and find ways to understand, like you say, what your role is as a woman on the bench, and also learning from others about what does it look like to challenge the status quo, and what kind of presence can you have, and how can you do that in a way that shapes the bench and shapes society, but also maintains your integrity. And you've spoken on global platforms about gender justice, human rights, even climate change. And can you tell us a little bit more about why you think it's so important for women judges in particular to serve as voices, not just nationally, but internationally as well?
For me, my experience and my approach is that judgments tell a story. And it's important to know whose story the judgment is telling. If it's the woman's story, then you have to hear her story and you have to hear her voice in that judgment. And during my time on the bench, the objective has always been to bring out that voice. So, whether it's in a judgment or even when it's in a dissent, the idea is to bring out that voice. So, in a recent dissent that I gave in a rape case, where the majority's opinion felt that that a case of rape had not been established, the dissent basically gave the gender perspective that rape laws must be survivor centric, must be based on the survivor's experience, and move away from outdated standards of resistance and morality and look at what the survivor is saying. And the judgment focuses on a woman's dignity, on consent, on her constitutional rights. It then also goes on to explain, it looks at those outdated standards that were applied. It looked at those outdated standards and showed why they are so wrong and why they are no longer applicable, and how those standards now today undermine due process and fairness of trial, where we're better informed about what it means and how women feel when there are cases of gender based violence. The same approach in the Nadia Naz, in the workplace harassment case, where the court looks at workplace harassment and talks about a reasonable woman standard and says, listen, when you're looking at these cases, you have to look at what a reasonable woman will say, what a reasonable woman understands as harassment. Similarly, in cases about women who are not that educated, who are not that outgoing, who stay at home, whom we in our legal jargon call pardanashi women, the court and the judgments that we've authored has held that relationships of trust and dependence cannot become tools of exploitation. So women are commonly known to be exploited by their near and dear ones. So we're not going to look at the relationship, but we're going to focus on her rights. We're going to focus on whether she was informed about the transaction, whether she was aware of what she was signing, whether she gave her consent. And we're not just going to assume any of that. So women judges help to advance that story. And when these women judges from Pakistan take on the international stage, they help challenge the stereotype that often defines how women in Pakistan are seen. They show that our judiciary is deeply committed to engaging in advancing gender justice and human rights, that we understand climate change and the impact it has on the population, particularly women. And more importantly, it gives women judges in Pakistan as well as internationally to help develop their own network, like the IAWJ, to develop their own network and their own communities where they can exchange ideas and where they can start looking at things from a different perspective. Again, I think this is important because you don't want to be repeating what's already happening. You don't want to be joining communities which are sticking to the single dimensional narrative. You want different narratives. And that happens when you become part of communities which are examining those different narratives. So, women judges, both locally and internationally, demonstrate through their existence, through their judgments, really how we celebrate our progress of being on the bench.
Absolutely. And I think you really have been highlighting today the need for telling this story, right? And advancing that story and how critical that is when cases come before the courts.
Definitely, but you've also talked about the importance of highlighting the progress that's been made, in Pakistan and beyond, the ways that women are leading reforms. And of course, the importance of the community that you found in IWJ with women judges across the world and the necessity of women everywhere using their own voice, but also amplifying the voices of other women and highlighting those diverse perspectives to shift that narrative. From your international experience, what other lessons can countries learn from each other about advancing women in these leadership positions? And how can women judges globally continue to support one another in amplifying other women's voices?
I think one of the best lessons that we could learn when we collaborate internationally is that you get a chance to introspect and look at your own system, and you realize that pushing women into leadership position, encouraging women in the workplace is not about competition. It's about collaboration. It's about inclusion. The more we support each other, whether it's locally or across borders, the stronger the voice becomes. And by joining these different communities, you realize that you're not alone. You realize that there are solutions. And more importantly, you get to understand and share your own experience, which again shapes perspectives because it encourages new reasoning, new way of thinking. So there's this constant process that's evolving when you engage with different communities globally or even within your own system. We have different provinces, so even when women judges engage regionally at a provincial level, they learn from each other because the same law is interpreted in a different way based on the practices of that province. So it's vital. And I think judges learn best when they engage with other judges because they understand the language of reasoning, the language of the law, and they understand the role that they can play. So I think it's very important that we build communities which are outside of the existing system, which are not part of the existing system, which the system doesn't rely on, but we build them bigger and better and stronger so that ultimately they become a part of the system.
Absolutely. I think we've been talking a lot today about building community and across, as you mentioned, what people can learn even across provinces at the national level, but then clearly also across geographic borders and culture as well. As we close out for our discussion today, just want to highlight that you've been honored around the world and you describe your work, I think today, but also generally as commitment to service, right? Rather than necessarily recognition. But, you have made tremendous kind of path in your own country. And I think that you've had a tremendous legacy, even in influence around the world. What legacy do you hope to leave, for women judges and the judiciary, both in Pakistan and across jurisdictions, Justice Malik?
I think for me, legacy is all about setting footprints and leaving footprints that cannot be erased. So those footprints that I hope that I will leave behind through my judgments, through the decisions that I've made, will ultimately lead to some kind of progress, some kind of change, where I hope to see a judiciary that consciously values the gender perspective, not just as an exception, but as an essential part of how we understand justice. And there is a difference between the large community of male judges and the smaller community of women judges. I find that men tend to support one another instinctively, but women are still learning how to support one another consciously. This is because probably women compete for their space all the time, so they don't have that instinct yet to rely on these support systems. And I would like to see that changed as well. I'd like to see an environment where women uplift each other, share experiences, build confidence in one another's voices. And I'd like to see a system where women are acknowledged, where they're respected, where they are able to participate, where they're included, where this becomes the foundation of the system and it's no longer just the exception. And I think I'd like to see, most importantly, that as the law evolves, as the law changes with time, the gender perspective becomes part of the narrative because the law must reflect equality not only in language but also on its impact, on how it's applied, on who it protects, and whose realities it understands. So if I leave anything behind, it is this hope and this desire that others will follow in these footsteps, but in a stronger way, with a louder voice, and with a more forceful reminder that inclusion must be collective, that progress depends on the strength of our including women in our reasoning, including women in our decision making, and making space for them.
I think you put it so beautifully and so powerfully, Justice Malik, and thinking about the very fabric of justice and the very fabric of society. And What a beautiful legacy that you have already started to establish and will no doubt leave behind. I have a bit of a trickier question that we like to close by asking all of our guests. And that's in one word, what do you think will have the greatest impact on advancing women's leadership in law?
Hmm. So, if I had to choose one word, it would be perseverance. I think that's the word that drives me because change takes time and it takes strength to keep pushing forward even when the system is slow to move. So, for all women in this justice sector, every step forward often comes with many setbacks. But perseverance means showing up again and again, being stronger, being more resilient, and even when things are difficult, believing that your presence matters. So, I think my word would be don't stop with the perseverance.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you're the first one to say perseverance, but I think it's such a powerful word and I think that you're absolutely right in terms of what transformation could look like. We're so grateful that you were able to join us today, Justice Malik, and we're so thankful for all the powerful insights that you've brought today to us and to our audience. It's just a joy to speak with you. And your journey reminds us that the Supreme Court is not only a forum for interpreting the law, but also a place where justice itself can be transformed. And as the first woman to serve on Pakistan's highest court, you've broken historic barriers, set bold precedents, and invested in mentoring others and building a very strong community, showing us that true leadership is defined by perseverance, principle, and impact.
Yeah, and we just want to thank you again. Your story is such a powerful reminder that progress in the judiciary is ongoing. And as you said, perseverance is really key. And with a trailblazer like you, we see how barriers can fall, opportunities can expand, and your vision of a more inclusive, equitable system moves us closer to what is in fact a reality on the ground of the diverse perspectives that exist. Your path is not just her story, it's a guide, I think, for women judges of tomorrow who will continue to advance justice with courage and conviction. So thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for having me.
Thank you for tuning into Justice Beyond the Bench. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Want to learn more about our work and support our mission? Visit us at iawj.org, where you can explore our programs, join our global network, or make a donation to help advance gender equity in judiciaries around the world. See you next time.